Somewhere beneath the rolling grassland of South Africa's cradle of humankind, there is a passage so narrow that most adult human bodies simply cannot pass through it. A jagged vertical fissure, barely wider than a shoulder, dropping into a steep, smooth chute that falls away into total darkness. On the other side of that fissure lies a chamber that has produced one of the most explosive, unresolved arguments in the entire field of human evolution, a fight that, remarkably, is still being waged in scientific journals as you watch this. The remains found deep inside that chamber belong to more than 15 individuals of a species called Homo naledi, a small-statured hominin with a brain roughly a third the size of yours, who lived somewhere between 335,000 and 236,000 years ago. On its own, a large collection of ancient bones deep inside a nearly inaccessible cave would already be remarkable. What turned this into one of the most contested debates in modern paleoanthropology is a specific, staggering claim, that these small-brained individuals didn't simply end up in that chamber by accident. According to one research team, they carried their dead there, deliberately, dug shallow pits by hand, laid bodies inside them, and covered them over, behavior that, if genuine, would represent the oldest known deliberate burial performed by any hominin species on Earth, predating the earliest confirmed burials by modern humans or Neanderthals by more than 100,000 years. The same team has gone further still, suggesting that geometric markings carved into the cave walls nearby represent deliberate symbolic art, made by hands connected to a brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's. Other researchers, examining the exact same physical evidence, have reached the opposite conclusion entirely, arguing there simply isn't enough there to support either claim. Neither side has backed down. This is the story of what lies in that chamber, why it matters so enormously, and why, after years of argument, nobody has definitively won. Before any of the controversy, there was simply Homo naledi itself, a genuinely strange combination of traits packed into one small body. Above ground, in the open grassland surrounding the cave system, these were creatures built for a life split convincingly between two very different modes of movement. Their legs and feet were remarkably human-like, built for efficient, sustained upright walking across open terrain, in a stride that would look almost unremarkable next to a modern human's. Their hands told a completely different story. Long, distinctly curved fingers, exactly the kind of anatomy you'd expect in a species that spent serious time climbing and gripping branches overhead, sat attached to a wrist and thumb capable of the kind of precise, controlled grip needed to make and use deliberate stone tools. And then there was the head, a face and set of teeth that, at a glance, looked surprisingly close to a modern human's, sitting above a braincase roughly one-third the volume of yours, smaller, by some measures, than almost any other member of the genus Homo ever identified. This wasn't a creature caught halfway between ape and human in some tidy evolutionary sense. It was a genuine mosaic, walking upright like us, climbing like something far more ancient, thinking with a brain dramatically smaller than anything previously associated with complex behavior. Groups of these individuals moved across the open grassland surrounding what would eventually become one of the most argued about cave systems on the planet, foraging, climbing for safety or food, gathering in small, cooperative bands, entirely ordinary hominin behavior, right up until they apparently started doing something that, by every previous assumption in the field, their brains simply shouldn't have been capable of organizing. Getting into the chamber at the center of this entire argument requires a journey that sounds more like a caving expedition than a walk to a burial site. From the unremarkable, easily overlooked entrance at the base of a rocky outcrop, the passage narrows steadily, daylight fading fast as the route descends. Eventually it reaches a genuinely extreme constriction, a jagged vertical fissure barely wider than a person's shoulders, forcing anyone passing through it to turn sideways and exhale just to fit. Beyond that fissure waits a steep, smooth chute, dropping sharply into a chamber far below, a chamber that, once reached, opens into a genuinely vast dark space, the kind where a single torch barely reaches the surrounding walls. This isn't a passage anyone stumbles into by accident. It requires deliberate, repeated, difficult effort to reach, which is itself one of the central pieces of evidence at the heart of the entire debate. Whatever ended up in that deep chamber almost certainly didn't arrive there through some simple, unplanned accident. The physical difficulty of the route makes accidental entry, or accidental transport by water or scavenging animals, a genuinely hard case to argue convincingly, though not an impossible one. If Homo naledi individuals really were making this journey repeatedly, navigating that fissure and chute with the kind of practiced familiarity that suggests they'd done it many times before, that alone would already represent a remarkable level of planning, memory, and social coordination for a species carrying a brain this small. Here's the specific claim that turned this from an interesting cave system into a genuine scientific firestorm. Within that deep chamber, and in a smaller connected space nearby, researchers led by Lee Berger reported finding skeletal remains arranged in ways they argue are inconsistent with bodies simply decomposing where they fell. Instead, they described shallow depressions dug into the chamber floor, bodies positioned deliberately within them, in one case, curled in a crouched posture with a stone tool positioned close beside a still hand, and then, according to the team's interpretation, covered back over with sediment carried in by hand rather than deposited naturally. If accurate, this would represent genuine, deliberate mortuary behavior, recognizing death, choosing a specific, remote, difficult-to-reach location, physically preparing a resting place, and returning to complete that same difficult journey more than once. Layered on top of that burial claim sits a second, arguably even bolder one, that Homo naledi deliberately carved geometric patterns, crossing lines cut into smooth sections of cave wall, using this same difficult-to-reach space almost like a private, symbolic gallery. Taken together, these two claims would append one of the most foundational assumptions in the entire study of human cognition, that symbolic thought, ritual behavior, and deliberate burial require a large, complex brain roughly our own size to organize and sustain. A brain one-third that size, according to this interpretation, was already doing both. It's worth sitting with exactly why this specific pair of claims lands with such force across the field. For decades, the size of the human brain has functioned as a kind of unspoken shorthand for behavioral complexity. Bigger brains, the assumption goes, unlock bigger cognitive capabilities, language, planning, symbolic thought, an awareness of death serious enough to prompt ritual. Homo naledi, on this account, breaks that assumption cleanly in half. If a species with a brain smaller than almost any other member of our genus was capable of organizing repeated, difficult journeys into total darkness specifically to deposit and cover the bodies of its dead, and was additionally capable of carving intentional, repeated symbolic patterns into rock, then brain size alone clearly isn't the gatekeeper researchers have long assumed it to be. That's not a small correction to an obscure detail. That's a genuine challenge to one of the load-bearing assumptions underneath the entire field's understanding of what makes complex human behavior possible in the first place. It would mean this kind of ritual, symbolic capacity might have evolved far earlier, and far more broadly across the hominin family tree, than anyone had previously considered plausible, not a unique gift belonging exclusively to large-brained species like our own and Neanderthals, but something more widely available across very different branches of humanity's past, hiding, quite literally, in a cave nobody had thought to look inside this closely until relatively recently. Naturally, a claim this significant invited serious, immediate scrutiny, and it deserved every bit of it. In late 2023, a group of specialists spanning biological anthropology, archaeology, geochronology, and rock art analysis published a detailed, peer-reviewed rebuttal, and their central objection was direct. The physical evidence, as documented, simply doesn't yet support the burial claim with the level of confidence the original announcement suggested. Their concerns were specific and technical. The skeletal remains in question were largely unarticulated, meaning individual bones weren't found connected in clear anatomical position, which makes reconstructing an original burial posture with real confidence genuinely difficult. Portions of the proposed burial features remained unexcavated at the time of the initial claims, leaving key questions about their true size, shape, and boundaries unanswered. And critically, the critics argued that natural explanations hadn't been adequately ruled out. Water is known to have flowed through these chambers at various points in the cave's long history, and moving water is fully capable of redistributing bones and sediment in ways that can superficially resemble deliberate burial without any intentional behavior behind it at all. Some reviewers went further, raising a genuinely uncomfortable possibility. that later visitors to the cave system, potentially even modern humans passing through at some point after Homo naledi, could be responsible for some of the disputed features, including the stone tool and the carved wall markings, rather than Homo naledi itself. What's made this dispute unusually visible, even by the standards of academic disagreement, is the specific way it played out in public. The original burial and rock art claims were first released as preprints through a journal called eLife, using an unusually transparent publishing model where reviewer critiques are posted publicly right alongside the paper itself, rather than staying hidden in a private editorial process most readers never see. That transparency meant the entire messy, back-and-forth argument between the original team and their critics unfolded largely in the open, visible to anyone following along, complete with pointed language from reviewers describing the claims as, in the words of one, entangled, premature, and speculative. The original team submitted revisions attempting to address these specific concerns, adding additional sediment analysis and further documentation. When reviewers examined that revised version in 2025, several remained genuinely unconvinced, continuing to flag what they saw as insufficient methodological rigor around exactly the kind of detailed sediment and burial context analysis that would be needed to settle a claim this significant. As of the most recent published exchanges, the disagreement hasn't been resolved. It simply continued, version after version, critique after critique, each side holding its position while the underlying physical evidence sits exactly where it has been for over 300,000 years, waiting for a level of analysis thorough enough to finally satisfy everyone involved. There's a genuinely important reason this particular disagreement deserves patience rather than a rush to pick a side. Claims this significant, the oldest deliberate burial in the hominin record, symbolic art made by one of the smallest brained members of our genus, carry enormous consequences for how the entire field understands human cognitive evolution, and extraordinary claims like that reasonably require an extraordinary standard of evidence before the wider scientific community accepts them as settled fact. That's not obstruction or gatekeeping. It's exactly how a field this consequential is supposed to function, particularly when a conclusion this dramatic would force a genuine rewrite of decades of established thinking about brain size and behavior. At the same time, dismissing the original claim outright would be just as premature as accepting it uncritically. The original excavation team includes researchers with deep, direct experience in this specific cave system, and their documentation, however contested by critics, represents years of extraordinarily difficult, physically demanding work conducted in one of the least accessible fossil sites on the planet. Both sides are working from the same underlying physical reality. What remains genuinely unresolved is exactly how confidently that reality can be interpreted as proof of deliberate, ritual human-like behavior, versus a more mundane, if still fascinating, natural explanation involving water, sediment, and time. So where does that leave Homo naledi today, heading further into 2026? Genuinely suspended, mid-argument, in a way that's honestly a little uncomfortable for anyone hoping for a tidy conclusion. The skeletal evidence remains exactly as puzzling and suggestive as it was when first reported. The rebuttals remain exactly as serious and methodologically grounded as when they were first published. Neither side has produced the kind of decisive, additional evidence that would settle the question definitively one way or the other, and the specific kind of detailed sediment micromorphology analysis that critics have repeatedly requested takes years of painstaking laboratory work to complete properly, particularly in a cave system this difficult to access and excavate. What's genuinely remarkable, regardless of how this specific argument eventually resolves, is that a species with a brain roughly one-third the size of a modern human's is even in serious contention for behavior this complex at all. Even in the most conservative reading of the evidence, favored by the harshest critics, Homo naledi was still navigating one of the most difficult cave systems ever documented, repeatedly, deep underground, in total darkness, using fire to light the way, behavior that, on its own, already demands a level of planning, memory, and social coordination that a brain this small was not traditionally assumed to be capable of organizing. And that's really the heart of what makes this story worth sitting with, whichever way the argument eventually breaks. Somewhere beneath that quiet, unremarkable stretch of South African grassland, a small-brained hominin species was doing something down in the dark that nobody fully expected from a brain that size, whether that something turns out to be full, deliberate, symbolic burial, or a more limited, still impressive pattern of repeated, purposeful visits to an extraordinarily difficult place. Either answer quietly rewrites part of what we thought we understood about the relationship between brain size and behavioral complexity. Which part of this argument sits with you the longest? That a brain a third the size of ours may have organized the oldest deliberate burial in the entire hominin record, that the researchers who found it and the researchers challenging them are both working from exactly the same physical evidence and still can't agree, or that this remains, right now, an active, unresolved scientific fight rather than a settled textbook fact. Drop your take below, and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. Subscribe for the next deep dive into the arguments this field still hasn't managed to close.